All right, topic 10, secondary data. So today we're going to talk about data that is not primary data. So everything we've talked about up to this point has been primary data, meaning data that you've collected yourself. But now we're going to talk about data that we did not collect ourselves, and we call that secondary data. Sorry, I was too enthusiastic. Okay, I'm just so excited that we're at topic 10. Trying to get myself together. Okay, so there are three types of secondary data that we're going to discuss this video. It should be a pretty short video, but that is agency records, and then secondary data like secondary research data, and then content analysis. So again, what we mean by the term secondary data is that it's data that you did not collect your damn self. Did you collect it yourself? Well, guess what? That's primary data. That doesn't have to do anything to do with this lecture. But if you did not collect it yourself, if some cop collected it for you, or if some court records people collected it for you, or if another researcher said, here's my data, analyze it differently, or if it's Disney movies, it's not you. It's secondary data. Okay, so agency records are records that are collected by criminal justice organizations or criminal justice people, right? Like police records, court records, prison records, juvenile delinquency records, and DCS, guess what? Records. Secondary research data is when another researcher collected data for some reason, and then you take that data and you reanalyze it. So from what I understand, you had Lawrence Sherman collected his data about hotspots, and then he came up with this whole hotspots thing, right? The whole directed patrols and how it reduces, how it increases deterrence in hotspots. And then later on, this dude named Christopher Koper took that data, and I might be wrong, but I know that I'm pretty sure that the Koper curve data is secondary data. And I'm pretty sure he got it from Lawrence Sherman. And then Chris Koper took that data and then looked at, well, what's the amount of time that people spent in each hotspot? And what was the optimal amount of deterrence that those hotspots, that the police had on those hotspots? So essentially, the way it works, that was a horrible explanation. Let me explain it better. So he took this data that someone else, so he took Lawrence Sherman's data that he collected for a different purpose, and then he looked at this data, and when Lawrence Sherman collected this other data, he included other information that he just didn't use in his own study. But then Chris Koper used that other information in his study of Sherman's data, and what he did was he said, okay, I'm going to look at how long there was a deterrence, what was the optimal amount of time for an officer to spend in a hotspot for it to have the longest lasting residual deterrence, meaning so essentially the way it works is if I'm about to commit a crime and then I see a cop drive by and I'm like, oh my gosh, cops, chill out, right? And then there's always that part where you're like, all right, I'm just going to wait a little while until the coast clears, right? And so Koper found that if you spend about, I think it was around about 10 to 14 minutes in one of these hotspots, you have the people wait longer to sort of for the coast to clear. But then if you also come back every now and then in random intervals, that throws people for a loop, right? And so by looking at some of this secondary data, he was able to come up with what Lawrence Sherman refers to as the Koper curve, meaning there's an optimal amount of residual deterrence that officers can have by being in hotspots. But that came from secondary research data. Then content analysis is when you look at any sort of social artifact and you pull a meaning or data out of that, and we'll go over that here in a second. So let's first talk about agency records, because a lot of research that we conduct in a criminal justice setting involves agency records. So you get three types of agency records. You get published statistics. These are government organizations who compile data for the purpose of research for people to use. So we click on this link by going clickety-clack, pra, right? Look, we are at BJS again. Remember when we took a survey by them? So let's look at some of their data. Here we go. Let's look at this. So just click on a PDF to make this easy, right? So these are crime statistics against persons with disabilities. So the cool thing is BJS will create these reports, or you can also get the raw data from them, right? So they collect the data, and then they have people create these reports for them, and then you can also grab the raw data. So let me see if we can find the raw data somewhere. Okay, so here we go. Here we have some data about number of federal officers with arrest and firearm authority by job function. So this looks at the types of, so this counts officers for us, right, in different contexts, in different states. Right, so this is all raw data then that people can mess with or compile and then find correlations and other forms of descriptions. And here we can download the Excel file. And then here we have crimes against persons, crimes against property, and we have all these numbers here. And so we can download for each year, and then we can put them all in the same file, and we can start creating trends and stuff, right? So all this data has been collected for the purpose of research by other agencies, or by government agencies. And so that is an example of published government organizations, published statistics. Then you get non-public agency records. This is where, so agencies, they produce data all the time, like run cards for police officers, like how many times do they go on a run. They take certain, budgetary stuff or certain victim characteristics. Like if you look at police reports, like not all police reports are made public in the way that these published statistics are, but you can go and take that stuff, you can take court records, and you can make sense out of it. You can count something in those, right? So those are agency records, but they're not made public for the purpose of research like published statistics are. And then you have new data that's collected by agency staff, and that's where you go to the agency, you go to maybe to EPD, and you ask them, hey, every time you encounter this, can you please write this down or fill out this form for me, right? And then you ask the agency to collect certain types of data for you for the purpose of research. Now, the deal here's the deal with published statistics, right? With stuff like the UCR, we've already talked about some of the issues with the UCR. One of the biggest issue with the UCR is the hierarchy rule, right? They only record the most serious offense out of a variety of offenses that might have occurred during an incident, right? These often depend on voluntary participation from police agencies to send that information in. And so, it's really big. It gives us very large estimates of what's happening in terms of crime, but it does have some validity issues. The nice thing is, though, is that these statistics are super cheap. I mean, I don't have to spend any money to get those stats. So I can conduct a bunch of research without spending much money, right? And it's very quick because it's secondary data. Now, non-public agency records, those can give us some more insights. We have a wider variety and scope of what we can study with non-public agency records. However, people don't collect data for the purpose of research in this case, right? The court clerk who's filling out something isn't saying, oh, someone's going to need this to be very reliable and valid one day. They're just doing their job, right? And sometimes they're tired. Sometimes they just want to go home. Sometimes they just want to get done with work, go to happy hour, right? So they're not putting the same amount of effort and concentration into every form that they fill out. With new agency collected data, you can pretty much tailor your study to anything that you want. You can just ask them to collect it, right? But the problem with that is that you can disrupt the way that things normally function. These people who are collecting the data for you are not researchers. They don't necessarily have the same thoroughness that you do, and they might not completely understand exactly to what capacity you want them to collect certain information, right? They might be forgetful, etc. Right? And that comes down to the social production of data, meaning that most criminal justice record keeping isn't done for the purpose of research. It's mostly done for doing their jobs, right? It's like when you have to fill out a whatever timesheet at work, right? You don't do that saying, oh, someone's going to collect data on this one day. Someone's going to want to conduct research on this, right? It's just a social process, and it's not as thorough as a scientific process. People don't do that with the aim of saying, hey, some scientist is going to collect this one day. Is going to want to look at this one day. And a lot of criminal justice data reflects reactions to behaviors, and what that means is that an affidavit, right, or like an arrest report is a reaction to someone's behavior, right? A complaint, a police complaint that's filed, is a reaction to someone's behavior. A use of force report is a reaction to someone's behavior, and so the more data you use from agency records, the larger the volume of the data, the more chances there are for error, right? Because there's just more. When you have a larger volume of things, there are more hands that touched it, right? Like, let's say I'm collecting complaint data from like 30 years at Evansville Police Department. Well, Evansville has had like several internal affairs officers who've done their jobs differently, who've collected things and interpreted things differently. So you have some reliability and validity issues there. But still, it's cheap, it's fast, and there is still some legitimacy or some validity to this information, even though it's not 100% reliable, even though it's not 100% validity. There's still a lot of use you can take from this. You can still see some important information from this. Content analysis is different. Content analysis is when you look at any social artifact, and you want to see, you want to learn something from it. So there's this one famous study that was conducted where someone watched Disney movies, and then they pointed out every time there was a sexual innuendo in a Disney movie, right? And so you learn something by looking at the content like that. Another thing we might do is look at high grossing video games versus low grossing video games, and seeing the amount of violence that's in there, right? Or maybe seeing or maybe looking at video games and looking, especially when you look at RPG video games, right? You might play the game and then play each game and then say, okay, let's rank these games based on their popularity, based on their sales, and then we want to look at these games and see, do they, like, with like games like Fallout 3 or 4 or any of these RPG games, right? You can sometimes take a diplomatic stance on something. Other times you can be violent, right? Or if you play a game like Civilization 6, right? Sometimes you can try to solve things diplomatically, or sometimes you can just go to war with someone. Well, and so what researchers might want to do is they might want to look at, okay, let's first rank a bunch of strategy-based games, RPGs or RTSs, right, in their order of how many sales they had nationally. And then we want to see how easy is it to do the diplomatic choice versus the violent choice, right? And then rate. And then maybe you can find some sort of correlation. Oh, well, the more expensive the game, right? The more the easier it is to pick the violent choice, right? What does that say then about society, or what society wants, or whatever? Although you also have to control for other factors like how easy is the freaking game to play, because geez. But that's the thing. Or you can look at tweets, right? That's something I think is going to be very important in a couple of years from now, is when people are studying what were people hashtagging over time, and then what does that say about society, right? How do hashtags, or the types of hashtags that people give, right, or the categories of hashtags that so maybe, for instance, you can maybe look at, between the year 2008 And 2018, the highest ranking hashtags had to do with popular culture. But then from 2018 through 2028, there were more hashtags involving politics, right? They were ranking higher over time, right? And so that can tell you something about what people think is important. So social artifacts is anything, again, that we produce and you can study. Like, you can look at popular TV programs, popular video games, popular movies, and what their content is and how people appreciate it, right? It can tell us, who says what, to whom do they say it, why do they say it, and to what effect, right? It gives us an understanding into social processes and culture and subculture that other data just can't. But again, you have to remember that when someone made a movie, or when someone wrote a song, or when someone tweeted, they didn't say, oh, someone's going to want to conduct content analysis on this one day, right? So there's always that. It's heavily dependent on interpretation, and not everyone might interpret everything the same way. It's not always as cut and dry as you'd like it to be, but it is still really cool. You can still look at some very cool things, right? Especially if it's something that, like a TV program that's lasted as long as South Park, or like if you look at just Marvel or DC Comics, or like I said, I think Twitter is going to be a huge, or social media are going to be a huge source of content for content analysis in the future, when people want to look at what did people think was important in the past, how did that change, and why. And so you need to come up with some sort of a conceptual framework when you're coding this, right? You need to say, okay, I'm going to look at violence, and then you need to operationalize and define, what do you mean? Well, what does violence entail? What does sexual violence entail, right? What does patriarchy entail, right? One thing that I've noticed when you watch the show Friends, watch the show Friends and point out, you can probably sit there and you can find there's a way more patriarchal content and homophobic content in there than what would be considered appropriate today. The same with The Office, right? And that tells you something about what the culture tolerated back then, right? And so stuff like that, you would consider that to be manifest content, right? But then there's also latent content. Like, what is the overall meaning behind that? What's the message of that particular episode you watched, right? And this is often the case with South Park. If you watch South Park, right, South Park has a lot of sort of manifest content, which is blatant. They make like a fart joke, or they make a very crass, very offensive joke, right? But then oftentimes their South Park episodes each have an underlying meaning or a message behind them, right? And they often they'll attack the Church of Scientology or groups like that, but they'll do it subtly with underlying meaning, and that's considered latent content. But again, when it comes to content analysis, you have to make your operational definitions, meaning how you're going to collect the data, what type of content will fall under what type of category. You have to make that super clear, because you will have some inter-rater reliability problems if you do not have clear operational definitions.